The Great White North of Canada has given the wrestling world a lot of great performers over the years. Hell, you could argue it's given us just as many, if not more, than places like the UK and Mexico. But who are the best to ever come from that part of the world? Well, that's exactly what we are going to be looking at right now, starting with Bret "Hitman" Hart. Yes, if you were to list the greatest wrestlers to ever do it, then Bret Hart would be very near the top of that list. And the reason he'd rank so highly is because he quite simply was the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be back when he was an active performer during the 80s and 90s. Seriously, never has a nickname ever been more apt than the one he gave himself, as it perfectly summed up what he represented. Of course, this rightfully made him a hero to Canadian fans everywhere then, as hailing from Calgary, he was the pride of that province, someone so good he even stood out from the rest of the Hart clan. And that's saying something because this is the clan which was led by the true Canadian wrestling royalty in the legendary Stu Hart. Just look at his resume, a resume which includes not only 7 world titles and multiple Hall of Fame inductions, but also a short list of matches which could be considered amongst the best of all time. We are talking about his WrestleMania 13 bout against Steve Austin, his King of the Ring showdown with Mr. Perfect, or his WrestleMania 10 Mat Classic with someone we'll get to in a moment. All of this is to say that it's hard not to think of Bret Hart as being one of the greatest wrestlers to ever come out of Canada. And it's hard not to be sad that his career would ultimately be cut short. But while this is sad, at least we got to have him for as long as we did, and at least he's still able to live a happy and mostly healthy life today where he's taken on the role of wrestling's greatest curmudgeon, someone known for 2 things, talking about how great he was and hating Bill Goldberg. But what about the person he fought at WrestleMania 10 in that all-time classic we alluded to a moment ago? Don't they deserve a spot in this video too? Why, yes they do, and that's why our next subject is none other than Owen Hart. That's right, as the younger brother of not only Bret Hart, but also Smith, Bruce, Keith, Dean, and Ross Hart, it was never going to be easy for Owen to stand out from the pack. But luckily, he was able to do this because early on, while growing up in Calgary at the Hart family compound, he'd prove himself to be something of a prodigy. Seriously, during those early days learning under his father in the infamous dungeon, he'd take to the ring like a duck to water. And this development only went faster once he started working for his father's promotion, Stampede Wrestling. Of course, his real breakout moment came during the early 90s though, when he headed down to America to wrestle for WWF, as that was where he got noticed by a bigger audience. And this audience would be wowed by what they were seeing from young Owen back then, as his high-flying antics were pretty groundbreaking for the time, and unlike what most fans had seen before. Would they lead to much success for him? Yes, they would, as by the time 1994 rolled around, he'd be breaking out as a singles act in a fantastic feud with his older brother over the WWF title. Sure, Owen would never manage to win that belt from Bret, at least not officially, but over the course of this program, he would show that despite being smaller, he was just as good as the Hitman in the ring. In fact, for some, he was even better. And this would mean that from that point onwards, he'd remain a constant presence in the company's upper mid-card, with him becoming a 2-time Intercontinental Champion, 1-time European Champion, and 4-time Tag Team Champion over the course of the next few years. Seriously, there's a reason why people like Chris Jericho and Kevin Owens have said that they were largely inspired to get into wrestling after watching Owen Hart do his thing. And that's because for a percentage of fans out there, the runt of the litter was the real King of Hearts, the one who was quietly even better than the excellence of execution. Sadly though, unlike with the Hitman, who's still alive today, Owen's time in this world would be cut short when he passed away in the ring at Over the Edge on May 23, 1999. But what about our next subject, that being none other than Kenny Omega? Now, if you wanted to talk about the best active in-ring competitors in the world today, then you'd be talking about a short list of people. And arguably, nobody is better than the best bout machine himself once the bell rings. Why is this? Well, because over the course of his 2-decade-plus long career, he's been raising the bar for what great wrestling can be, with many of his matches against the likes of Kazuchika Okada, Bryan Danielson, and Will Ospreay ranking amongst the greatest of this era. Obviously then, with him being a native of Winnipeg, this has made him a favorite of Canadian fans, as he is very much one of theirs. Even today, in fact, as his career begins to wind down, he's still putting out great matches on a regular basis. But then having a Match of the Year contender is old hat for Kenny at this point, as whether it's in New Japan or AEW, it's rare that he's ever not stolen the show. And that's not the only reason he ranks as one of the best to ever come out of the Great White North. No, there's also the impact he's had on the industry as a whole by being one of the founding fathers of AEW. Yes, because of the combined efforts of him and others, there is now another place to make a living as a wrestler in this era. And this has only been a good thing for the industry as it continues to get better. And with him being the AEW International Champion as of the time of this video's recording, we expect to see him go hard for a while yet. Of course, he's not the only great wrestler to come out of Winnipeg over the years, though. No, as it happens, the same thing could be said about our next subject too. That's right, it's time to talk about Chris Jericho. Come on now, when we're talking about great Canadian wrestlers, there was no way we were ever not going to talk about Chris Jericho. After all, you could argue that he's the most recognizable star to come out of Canada since Bret Hart at this point. And the reason he's so recognizable is because across 5 different decades now, he's been showing himself to be one of the best wrestlers on the planet. It doesn't matter if we're talking about his early days in places like CMLL and ECW, his first big breakout moment in WCW, his lengthy run in WWE, or his current home of AEW, he's done just about everything there is to do, everywhere there is to go. Just look at some of those matches against the likes of Kurt Angle, Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero, and Kenny Omega, just to name a few. And if that's not enough, look at all the belts he's won over the course of his career. 9 world titles, 2 of which made him both the first ever undisputed world champion in 2001 and the first ever AEW world champion in 2019. But as you've probably expected with him, there's much more to his case for being one of the greatest Canadian wrestlers ever than just his matches and gold. No, there's also his David Bowie-esque ability to completely reinvent himself on a whim, completely changing character every so often and making himself fresh in the eyes of fans all over again in the process. We're talking about gimmicks like those of Y2J, the soft-spoken suit and tie-clad villain, the purveyor of the list, and the demo god, just to name a few. Where will he go next? Who knows? At this rate, he'll end up carrying on for another decade and reinventing himself a further few times. Yes, we can't discount the idea that even into the 2030s, Chris Jericho will still be going strong, maybe as an AEW World Champion all over again. But he's not the only Canadian legend who currently works for AEW that's been seeking out that world title as of late. No, a man who's shared the ring with Y2J and multiple companies has recently made it his mission to dethrone Jon Moxley, and that man is our next subject as it happens, Edge. That's right. As a native of Orangeville, Ontario, a small town just outside of Toronto, Adam Copeland can call himself a proud Canadian. And that's a badge of honor he's worn throughout his wrestling career as he represents his country. Even during his early days in WWF at the turn of the millennium when, while he was still going by the name of Edge and was technically supposed to be a vampire, he was one who hailed from the Great White North. Of course, it was never a huge focus of his character back then, though. No, being from the land of maple syrup, hockey, and denim wouldn't be a real part of his character until he split off from Gangrel in 1998, and along with someone else we'll get to in a moment, started down a path of completely reinventing tag team wrestling in the WWF. Yes, it was his involvement in those now iconic tables, ladders, and chairs bouts at the turn of the millennium which first solidified Edge as a great. And his case for being a great would only get stronger as the mid-2000s rolled around and he began embarking on a solo career, one which would see him become the first ever Mr. Money in the Bank in 2005 and an 11-time world champion overall. Sadly though, like with Bret Hart, Edge's career would be cut short in 2011. Or at least that's what we thought was going to happen. With advancement in medicine, however, it would be in 2020 that he shocked the world by returning to the ring at that year's Royal Rumble. And for the next few years following that, Edge would continue to be a main event force in WWE as he feuded with the likes of Randy Orton, Finn Balor, and Roman Reigns. That said, this run would ultimately come to an end in 2023 and he'd move over to AEW. And since joining that promotion, he's become a 2-time TNT champion. Will he ever get that elusive world title win in Jacksonville? We'll have to wait and see. But even if Adam Copeland never wins the world title in AEW, he'll still be one of their top stars, as he's just that much of a legend at this point. Is he as much of a legend as our next subject, though? His real-life best friend and the former tag team partner we alluded to earlier? Well, let's find out right now as we look at the story of Christian. Yes, like with Edge, Christian was born just outside of Toronto, in his case, in Kitchener, Ontario. And after becoming a school friend to Edge as a young man, the pair would find a shared love in wrestling and decide to try and make a career out of it together. Obviously then, this would be successful as both are now legends of the industry. For Christian, though, his path would be a little different, as after their run as a tag team together came to an end, his attempt to branch out as a solo act in WWE wouldn't find the same level of success. Why was this? Well, Vince McMahon just never saw a star in him. And looking to prove his boss wrong then, Cage would go over to TNA for a while, where he there truly broke out as a solo act for the first time by becoming a two-time NWA World's Champion. And you all know what happened after that. Eventually, he'd return to WWE and there win the World Heavyweight title twice, finally establishing himself as a player. And much like his former tag team partner Edge, Christian would also enter semi-retirement, with this happening for him in 2014. Not that this would be the last time he ever wrestled, though. No, in 2020, after making a cameo appearance at that year's Royal Rumble, he'd sign on the dotted line with AEW. And so good as he'd been there, he's managed to become a huge hit with audiences despite being a despicable heel. And on top of that, he was also able to completely revive the fortunes of the TNT title in late 2023 and early 2024 when he went on his run with it. What has he done since then? Well, he's continued to be a presence on both Dynamite and Collision, with his last big win coming when he won the Casino Gauntlet match at All In Wembley Stadium. And with it not looking like he has any intentions of slowing down anytime soon, we have to expect to see him to continue on with his winning ways for a few years yet. But what about female wrestlers from Canada? Well, when it comes to the title of greatest, that honor might go to our next subject, Trish Stratus. Seriously now, while there have been some very good female wrestlers to hail from north of the border, names like Gail Kim and Natalya, it's hard to argue that the biggest star of them all wasn't Trish Stratus. And the reason she became such a big star was because back during the early 2000s, it was her, along with Lita and Mickie James, who were keeping the flame of women's wrestling alive. Unlike with those other two women though, the woman from Toronto never started out with the expectations being that she'd become a great wrestler. No, she was seen in far more of a fitness model valet role during her early years. But unwilling to just be eye candy, she insisted on improving her craft in the ring to the point that, by the time her full-time run in WWE was over, she'd be a 7-time women's champion. And not just a 7-time champion either. No, come the mid-2000s, Trish would be a bona fide legend and someone who many considered to be the greatest women's wrestler in the history of WWE. Obviously then, with such a hefty legacy, Stratus was content to head into retirement for good here and rest on the laurels of a reputation she'd built for herself, right? Well, no. Rather, she's continuing to make periodic returns to the ring over the years to face off against more modern stars like Becky Lynch and Charlotte Flair. Even in 2025, in fact, she's still showing us all what she can do as an ally to Tiffany Stratton, and in doing that, she's proving she's just as good as she ever was in the ring, despite the fact that she's now 49 years old. That's right, Trish has aged like a fine wine. But then what else would you expect from the woman who gave us such classic feuds as the ones she had with Mickie James and Lita, and who also broke down so many barriers for what a woman could do in ruthless aggression era WWE? Hell, it was all of these achievements and more which led to her being inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2013. Needless to say then, this has made her a very popular figure in Canada, the place she still calls her home after all these years, and it will continue to make her a legend of that country, as we don't see any other Canadian women coming up who are looking like they're going to be taking her spot of GOAT anytime soon. But let's move away from the ladies for a moment and back over to the guys again, as it's there we find our next subject, someone who, at least in kayfabe, comes from a very different part of the world than the Great White North. But don't let the kilt fool you, because the truth is our next subject, Roddy Piper, is actually a very proud Canadian. Yes, many fans may have thought Roddy Piper was actually from Scotland, but the truth is, unlike Drew McIntyre or Joe Hendry, Piper never hailed from the land of Caledonia. Rather, he was from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. So why was his gimmick that of a Scotsman then? Well, because his mother, Eileen, was of Scottish descent, and having this cultural background in his family led to young Roddy learning how to play the bagpipes at a young age. So when he started wrestling and was looking for a gimmick, he decided to bring his bagpipes to a show so he could play himself out to the ring. And this led to the ring announcer there referring to him as Roddy the Piper. Obviously then this stuck because soon he'd just be Roddy Piper. And it was under this name that the Canadian made quite a name for himself all around the North American territory circuit, particularly in Portland, where he became a huge star, and in Jim Crockett Promotions, where he was one half of a truly brutal dog collar match against Greg Valentine at the first ever Starrcade in 1982. Of course, for as great as he was in those places though, what people probably remember Piper for best today is his time in WWF during the 80s, where after entering into a feud with Hulk Hogan, he'd be involved in the main event of the inaugural WrestleMania in 1985. And this makes him an essential element of that first ever boom period in the WWF happening. Seriously, were it not for Roddy's contributions in playing the perfect foil to the Hulkster, there might never have been a rock and wrestling era. And that would mean wrestling as we know it today wouldn't exist. And after feuding with Hogan, he'd continue to have great moments in the ring, either in the WWF, where he had a very memorable match with Bret Hart at WrestleMania 8, or in WCW, where he served as an on-screen authority figure for a while. And then there's his work outside of the ring as an actor, with probably his most famous work in that area coming when he starred in John Carpenter's 1988 cult classic, They Live. Sure, he might never have won a world title, but the truth is Roddy didn't need this in order to become a legend. No, he could do that on his own. And that's why he remains a pop culture icon to this day, among other great Scottish pop culture figures like Groundskeeper Willie and Scotty from Star Trek. Hell, even as recently as the early 2010s, he was still appearing in TV shows like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, introducing himself to a whole new audience again in the process. Honestly, given how important he is to Canadian wrestlers, there's a pretty good chance Roddy Piper was at least a partial inspiration to our next subject, another great heel from the Great White North with a gift for the gab, Kevin Owens. That's right, over the last decade or so, Kevin Owens has been showing us all his brilliance, as whether he's been working on Raw, SmackDown, or NXT, in the mid-card, the main event, or the tag team division, he's regularly been a standout performer. Of course, he's been great since long before this though, because as far back as his early days working on the indie scene in his native Canada, he was proving to be a rare talent. As you can imagine then, this had pretty much made him the pride of Quebec, and it has seen him succeed everywhere he's wrestled outside of WWE too, whether that be Combat Zone Wrestling, where he became a one-time Iron Man champion, Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, where he became a three-time world champion, or Ring of Honor, where he became a one-time world champion and one-time tag team champion. Honestly, it's hard to think of a place the man then known as Kevin Steen couldn't excel in, as even if you take his great in-ring work out of the equation, he'd still have a great role as a mouthpiece. And that's because, as one of the best talkers in the game today, there are few, if any, who can match him when he's on top of his game. And of all the Canadian wrestlers to do it, he may even be on many fans' Mount Rushmore. And that's why it's so well deserved that since joining WWE, he's become a one-time NXT champion and a one-time Universal champion, as well as a two-time WrestleMania main eventer. Hell, his first WrestleMania main event saw him get to wrestle a hero of his in Stone Cold Steve Austin in what marked the Rattlesnakes' first match in almost 20 years. And the second one? Well, that got to see him team up with his real-life best friend to win the undisputed tag team titles from the Usos. So it's certainly been a hell of a run he's had in the WWE. But what of that best friend? Isn't he Canadian too? Why, yes he is. And he's our next subject. Who are we talking about here? Why, Sami Zayn, of course. Now, if you were looking for someone in wrestling today who plays the role of lovable underdog better than anyone else, basically the role of modern-day Mick Foley, then Sami Zayn would undoubtedly be that guy. That said, it's not just his nice guy credentials which have made him so beloved by audiences. No, there's also the fact that the Quebec native is also a fantastic performer. And this has been true since as far back as his early days in places like Chikara, Ring of Honor, and PWG, with it being in the latter that he became a two-time world champion. Of course, like with his best friend Kevin Owens though, it's Sami's time in WWE most will be familiar with him for today. After all, that's the run which saw him really become the heart and soul of NXT back when that brand was becoming the best thing about the North American wrestling scene for a while. And after he moved up to the main roster, well, after a few false starts, he'd turn into an even bigger star when in 2022, he became a key part of the Bloodline saga. Yes, Zayn was a huge part in helping bring along this new boom period in WWE, as him joining the Bloodline brought a lot of lapsed fans back into the fold. And it was his eventual realization that he was being manipulated by the tribal chief, as he from there laid him out with a steel chair and challenged him for the title in Montreal, that still represents a huge high mark in WWE history. Sure, he wouldn't win the title in Montreal, but so over was Sami by then, he would remain at or near the top of the card in the years following, with him eventually winning gold when he teamed up with KO to win the tag team titles from the Usos at WrestleMania 39. And a year after that, he'd even win some singles gold, as this was when he'd beat Gunther for the Intercontinental title at WrestleMania 40. All of this is to say then that as it stands today, Sami Zayn is a made man, and rightfully so, because he's one of the best wrestlers in the world and one of the finest Canadian exports we've ever seen. But then everyone we've looked at today can count themselves amongst Canada's greatest wrestling exports.